It's not the case that people walk around saying, you know, women ought to be barefoot and pregnant or in the home or are here to serve men. They're not saying anything explicitly about the inferiority of racial groups, etc. But nonetheless, they have implicit attitudes that they may not even be aware of that are affecting their behavior. So people, and there's very, very good research on this, suggesting that even many of us who hold very egalitarian beliefs explicitly behave in ways that reveal implicit bias. Okay, so this is one of the hypotheses that has come forward to suggest that our slow progress on social justice is really still in a form of individual bias, that we are individually biased, though we're not so aware of it. So, looking at the handout, I'm through the second point. I'm reading, although I'm convinced that implicit bias plays a role in perpetuating injustice, as they stand, such explanations of systematic injustice are implausible or at the least incomplete, but then we need to develop the explanation. I'm going to argue that social practices are central both to understanding and remedying social injustice. Okay, so implicit bias in ideology. Why is it incomplete? So typically, implicit bias is considered in individual terms. It's like, Greg, he had to hire Kathy, Kwame, or Rick. Who did he hire? He hired Rick. Now, we say he didn't have an explicit bias, but he implicitly did that. And so he just implicitly didn't want the woman or the black in his company. And you say, okay, so are you suggesting that the whole explanation of ongoing social injustice is that there are lots and lots of individuals who just keep making this decision to do things in a way that's biased? Is that really the explanation? I think that that doesn't go far enough. That doesn't explain how systematic and durable social injustice really is. So one of the reasons is that it's no accident that these separate individuals are all making these biased decisions. It's no accident that there is this systematicity to what's going on. In the implicit bias literature that just talks about what's in my head or your head, it doesn't get at why that's so systematic. So one way I think of accounting for the systematicity is to link implicit bias with ideology. Okay, so I'm at number 3 on the handout. Racism as ideology. I'm going to spend some time talking about racism as an example of how we might see ideology as having this systematic and cumulative effect. So when we ask what is racism, what are we looking for? We might be asking, here's A, what are the beliefs and attitudes in virtue of which someone counts as a racist? Beliefs that Latinas are lazy, that Arabs are terrorists. Or we might be asking, what are the institutions, laws, and social structures that impose unfair burdens on certain racial groups? Voter suppression laws, segregation. We might be asking, what is the moral wrong in injustice? Racial bigotry or hatred. So some people want to say the moral wrong of injustice is a personal wrong, that you have a lack of respect or a lack of love for the other, that is what's the moral wrong. Or it might be that it's structural injustice. There are systematic disadvantages, you say in tax law, in marriage law, and things like that. Or we might be asking what best explains the existence and persistence of racial wrongs, whether they are manifested in these attitudes, institutions, or structures. So these are all very different and important questions that you might be asking about racism if we're trying to understand what racism is. And depending on our answer to D about the explanation, different anti-racist strategies are going to make sense. So what explains it, hopefully, is going to give us some causal purchase on what's sustaining it over time. Now, Tommy Shelby, he's a professor of philosophy and African American studies at Harvard. He, along with many others, takes up the explanatory question, D, and argues that we should understand racism as fundamentally a type of ideology. So let me quote, he says, racism is a set of misleading beliefs and implicit attitudes about races or race relations whose wide currency serves a hegemonic social function. So racism is a set of misleading beliefs and the implicit attitudes that serves this hegemonic social function. Well, what does he mean by ideology? He says, an ideology is a widely held set of loosely associated beliefs and implicit judgments that misrepresent significant social realities and that function through this distortion to bring about or perpetuate unjust social relations. So we've got this set of beliefs, shared beliefs, and other kinds of attitudes, and that they misrepresent some kinds of social realities, but that misrepresentation undergirds these social practices and social structures. Okay, so Shelby's answer to the explanatory question includes an answer, I think, to the moral question, because he's trying to say this explains how racism works, and we can then understand the moral wrong. He says, I want to suggest that the morally troubling features of these beliefs and assumptions lies not in their specific content, but in their social function. They contribute to the production and reproduction of unjust social arrangements by concealing the fact that these arrangements are unjust. So there's that false misrepresentation of certain social realities that sort of hides the fact that there's bad stuff going on, unjust stuff going on. What sort of social arrangements does he have in mind? He says those in which matters of basic liberty, the allocation of vital resources, access to educational and employment opportunities, and the rule of law are at stake. So you might imagine an idea, a belief that blacks are violent, right? Arabs are terrorists, these sorts of things. These misrepresent the facts, but they undergird social practices about police brutality, about interrogation of Arabs and Arab Americans, things like that, that they undergird those practices which are unjust. Now, the mechanism by which racist ideology contributes to social injustice is through these distorted beliefs. Now, the bold is mine in this next quote. Both dimensions of racial ideologies, content and function, are the proper object of social criticism. He says their content justifies epistemic criticism, their function justifies moral criticism. So when we're looking at ideology, what happens? We encode these beliefs in us, we act on those beliefs, the beliefs are false, so we have to criticize them epistemically, say they're unjustified or false, but they also have this bad function, so we have to criticize how they have this bad function, what function what things they result in and cause. So Shelby's view allows us to provide at least preliminary answers to the 4 questions that I started with. Racism consists in an ideology that includes false or distorted but widely held beliefs about racial groups, specifically those attitudes that promote the formation and perpetuation of structures that unjustly advantage or disadvantage those groups. So he's got a package deal here that answers all the questions. Now, I'm sympathetic with a lot of what he says, but I'm going to spend some time criticizing him. And these are the places where I'm going to start to point to the things which I'm more critical of. If racism is to be understood as racial ideology, then to end racism, we should undertake ideology critique. On Shelby's view, the first and the primary step of critique will involve challenging the false or distorted beliefs in question through epistemic and moral criticism. So he has a particular kind of moral criticism he relies on using the theory of justice of John Rawls, and he also wants to criticize the epistemic beliefs by using science. So he says, in particular, that racism rests on the belief that there are such things as races, and that races are biologically real. What we do is we find out from the biologists or the scientists that races aren't biologically real, and so they are socially constructed, and this shows us that a lot of our beliefs are false, and moreover, Rawls's theory of justice tells us that those beliefs are sustaining and perpetuating structures that are morally unjust. So that's his approach. And he says, so we have to rely on this. The second step after we do that critique is to have these criticisms widely acknowledged. And he says, in a word, ideologies perform their social operations by way of illusion and misrepresentation. What this means practically is that were the cognitive failings of an ideology to become widely recognized and acknowledged, the relations of domination and exploitation that it serves to reinforce would, other things being equal, become less stable and perhaps even amenable to reform. So the elites, the philosophers and the scientists, they criticize the ideologies, They find errors in the claims about races. They find problems with the kinds of structures that those ideologies support. And then what we need to do is get the media involved, get people who are going to spread the word about the falsehoods. And if we can convince people that we're right, then hopefully, he suggests, the systems will become less stable and amenable to reform. Okay, so I'm going to call this the cognitivist view of ideology and ideology critique, because it's all about criticizing beliefs and using elites, like people who have theories of justice and do science, to criticize those beliefs. Okay, so that's the cognitivist view. Now, I'm very sympathetic to Shelby's many aspects of his view, but I really don't think that ideology is a set of shared beliefs. That's my first problem. Here's Shelby again, which sort of reveals he's a little waffly on this himself. He says, ideologies are not generally attributed to individuals, but to social groups, whole societies, or historical eras. These are those commonly held beliefs and implicit judgments that legitimate stratified social orders or imperial projects. Indeed, the locus of ideology is common sense, that reservoir of background assumptions that agents draw on spontaneously as they engage in social intercourse. So he's making it's a reservoir of assumptions that is provided to us socially that we draw on, right? That doesn't look like it's just a set of shared beliefs. So I think there's already a bit of a tension in his own view. So the tension is, on one hand, if ideologies are sets of commonly held beliefs, it would seem that the content of the ideology is just what most people believe or believe together. But he also suggests that what people believe derives from the ideology that dominates in their social context. So, okay, so is it the case that the ideology is just what we believe? Or do what we believe derive from something else, namely these ideological assumptions? Well, how do we think about what it is that we're drawing from when we form those ideological beliefs? So again, I'm sort of interested in, it seems we need an understanding of why it is that we're forming these ideological beliefs and forming them together, right? It's not just random. So I think an adequate account of ideology needs to explain what it is for the ideology to be culturally shared, public, dominant, and as a source of shared beliefs rather than simply constituted by them. So, next bullet, through socialization we absorb many things, including a language, a set of concepts, a responsiveness to particular features of things and not others, and a set of social meanings. So we absorb many things as we're socialized, not just a set of beliefs. We absorb a language encodes concepts. Those concepts are used, right? A set of social meanings and practices. We absorb all of that through socialization. And Shelby himself points out, and here's his quote, individuals now absorb through processes of socialization and mass media the attitudes and habits of mind that are constitutive of racial ideology. So I think it goes beyond his idea of just a set of shared beliefs. Okay, section 5. So what I'm going to talk about now is about the pruning of our cognitive resources, the shaping of our cognitive resources when we're socialized, and how that works. And it's just a tiny little fragment of what is really an interesting area of expanding research. But I'm going to try and focus on a couple of main points. So given that we are bombarded with information as we go through life, right? You open your eyes and oh my God, there's all of this information that becomes available. You listen for just a second and there's more sound than you could possibly attend to at any given point. So in order to get around in life, we're going to have to be pretty selective in what we pay attention to. And in particular, we're going to need to coordinate with each other in order to live together. We're going to need to be able to communicate with each other in order to live together. And in order to do those, to communicate and coordinate, we have to be kind of selective in what is salient to us, what stands out to us. So if I point there and I say, I'm sure you're all proud of this, whatever, you'll know what I'm talking about, right? You'll know that I'm not suggesting that you're proud of the lectern, right? The lectern is not something to be proud of. It's the logo that you'd be proud of. But that triggering of that selection of all of the possible things I might have been pointing to. I might have been pointing to this corner of this podium, or the fact that it's covered with some interesting fabric, or, you know, or how tall it is, or how it's made of nice wood, or something like that. But no, you knew right away I wasn't talking about those things, that I was talking about the logo, right? So you already had to have a set of saliences that were available to you to narrow down what I was pointing to. And likewise, I noticed that we all organized ourselves very well tonight without anyone directing us. You all sat down in the chairs facing me, and I came and stood up here, and none of you came up and stood up here next to me, right? Right? Wow, that's interesting. Well, you coordinated, and you coordinated without anyone having to say, no, don't go up there, sit down here. Sally, you go up there. And you know, I didn't go sit in the back, because we have a lot of ways of coordinating that rely on rules, but also rely on things like the shape of the room, right? The shape of the room teaches us very quickly when we walk into it, this is where I need to sit, or that's where I need to sit, and I'm not supposed to stand up here, right? We know that, and we're cued to that by socialization. In that case, socialization into an academic context. Okay, so under Roman numeral 5, first point, all cognition involves shortcuts, selection, and compartmentalization. I'm going to skip the birds example. To organize ourselves into social systems, we deploy a capacity to coordinate and communicate, and part of socialization involves learning how to engage in social practices and adapting cognition to do so fluently. Now, although correction or improvement of cognition is always possible, meaningful correction can't just be a matter of pointing out the fact that our thinking is limited or biased, because all thinking is limited and in some sense biased. So here I'll use the bird example quickly. So if you believe that birds fly, maybe just implicitly, it does guide your driving behavior, say. So if you have a bird on the road, you don't really slow down, you think the bird's going to fly away. And it most of the time does. It might, if it doesn't, it might not if it has a broken wing, but the belief that birds fly is pretty stable, pretty secure, and guides our actions. But if you go to Australia, not so good, right? Because cassowaries stand in the road and they don't fly, right? And then you gotta go, oh, so if there's a cassowary in the road, you better stop, because they don't like to get out of the road. And you don't want to hit them because they're kind of rare and fascinating and beautiful. Okay, so you can't use birds fly everywhere. But if you don't go to Australia and you say birds fly, and I say, oh, no, they don't. You know, I know about cassowaries and penguins. You're going to say, yeah, right. So because you're relying on that for the context. For the context that you're in, the belief that birds fly suits you very well. We don't have non-flying birds, or at least not many non-flying birds around here. Okay, but so I can't just say, oh, you believe something false. Most of what we believe is an oversimplification of the facts. Okay. All right, so we have this cognitive pruning and shaping, and now I want to use that to think more about ideology. So Jack Balkin has a view that ideology isn't a set of propositions or beliefs, but a set of tools that culture provides us. And he uses the term cultural software for this dimension of culture. So let me quote. He says, to be sure, beliefs can be tools of understanding and can be used to create new tools. But more important objects of study are cognitive mechanisms that produce beliefs and other attitudes. Examples include the tendency to structure experience in terms of narratives, psychological methods of categorization, varieties of metaphoric and metonymic thinking, strategies for the reduction of cognitive dissonance, heuristics and biases employed in making judgments under uncertainty, and understanding by means of networks of conceptual oppositions of the form A is to B is C is to D. Now, I throw those out there mainly to give you a sense of the complexity and the diversity and the wide number of cognitive mechanisms and cognitive tools that we use to make sense of our environment, right? There's a lot of them. The term cultural software is clunky, and I think it has more negative associations than it's worth, but there are two important things to notice about the tools that culture provides us. The first is that cultural software is a kind of ambiguous thing. So software can both be the abstract thing that is written and can have instances. It's both the abstract thing that has many different instances, but also the software that's in your actual computer, right? It has that abstract version and the implementation of it in your computer. And what he's getting at when he's talking about software is the fact that these cultural norms, the cultural assumptions, the cultural presuppositions, both exist in an abstract sense, and they're also, just like software, they're instantiated in us, because we internalize them. They're available to us socially, publicly, etc. They're in the dominant culture. But as we're socialized, we absorb them. And it's like installing software in your computer. Now, I think it's a clunky example, and I think software makes people think that we're automata, just like society has programmed us to do certain things, and he didn't mean that. So I'm going to get rid of the term software because I think it's too misleading. But one of the advantages of it is it has these two levels, the abstract level and the implementation level. Okay. And so I think that we have to keep in mind that ideology is, and this is the second bullet, in the primary sense cultural rather than psychological or individual. The fact that blue means boy and pink means girl is a public cultural code that we learn through ordinary processes of socialization, much as we learn a language, right? Pink means blue, girl means blue, pink means girl, blue means boy. And it doesn't matter what you think. If you put your boy in pink and send him to primary school, stuff's gonna happen, right? Whether you like it or not, whether you think it means girl or boy or nothing, right? So these are public codes that we all learn, like we learn the meaning, so learn the meaning of stage or table or chair, things like that. Okay, in addition, the term, this is the third bullet, the term cultural software can apply to rather narrow task-specific codes or to a broader web of social meanings. So in the case of software, you can build a little piece of software to do a very small thing, right? Or you can build a whole operating system. And I think that there's a value in the Balkans analogy, because the same is true of ideology. You can have an ideology of a particular practice, or you can have a whole operating system, like capitalism, right? So capitalism, anti-black racism, patriarchy, these are operating systems. But they also have particular small bits of code that are part of them. Okay, so I'm going to use the term cultural schema rather than software for the codes that enable us to engage fluently in particular social practices. And I'm going to talk about those broad operating systems as like a cultural techne. Okay. So let's skip the next 2 points. So how does the picture compare, my picture I've just offered, with Shelby's idea that ideology is a set of beliefs? Well, first, on this view, ideology is a cultural techne whose parts are cultural schemas, codes, and symbols. But ideology is not just any cultural techne, it's one that functions to sustain unjust social structures. So in that way, I agree with Shelby. He also thinks that ideology has this negative or pejorative effect, that it's going to sustain unjust practices. But he thinks it's a set of beliefs, widely shared beliefs. I say, no, no, no. It's like the software, it's like the code that is created for our culture that gets internalized in us through socialization. And as number 2 is, the schemas are internalized not as beliefs, but as mechanisms that give rise to beliefs and other attitudes, and they in turn reinforce the techne. So, right, so the techne of coming in the room and sitting down when you're in the audience, that makes us build theaters like this, and then you do it, and that reinforces that that's what you're supposed to do. So there's this kind of looping effect. Okay, I'm going to skip the next 2 bullets and look at the picture. So let's look at the picture. I have a dog. My dog's name's Sparky. He's a good thing in my life. Now, what is the picture doing here? So what I'm suggesting is that there's a set of practices. So look at the picture with the dog with the line across it, no dogs allowed, and the person walking the dog, and all of this. These are a set of practices, walking your dog. And these practices, you learn to interpret certain codes, like the sign that says you can't bring your dog here, or that you have to scoop the poop, or you have to do that sort of thing. And so there's going to be a set of norms, a set of rules, etc., that guide us in these practices. And when you're a new dog owner, you got to learn some of those things, like when do you take your dog off leash, and when do you not, and when are they playing, and when are they not. And dog people, you know, they're very astutely cued to when are the dogs just playing, even though they're playing roughly, and when are things getting bad, right? So you pick up on, and then you have these cues with the other dog owners of who's going to get the leash first. I don't know, maybe you're not dog owners. Anyway, but there's this whole complicated set of practices that I imagine also vary from region to region or park to park. But you have those practices that include these rules for how to go about it, because we need to organize so our dogs don't kill each other. Okay, so we internalize that, okay, from the practice there are those arrows that go to the black head with the cogs, and so what we get is cognitive mechanisms. It's not beliefs so much, it's a kind of attentiveness and awareness and ability to see a code and interpret it. And it's not always even one that we can articulate, but it's available to us. So there's that mechanisms, and there are mechanisms, see the box above the head, says attention, perception, categorization. It does produce attitudes, emotion, memory, and action, all of those sorts of things, but they're filtered through these mechanisms that we've had to develop through socialization in the practices. Okay, and then those perceptions, attention, etc., feedback to reinforce the practices. So look, they have little doggy poop bags at the parks now, right? So that you don't even have to bring your own. And there are special parks for the dogs, and the special parks for the big dogs and the little dogs and all that kind of stuff. So that reinforces this in the same kind of looping effect. Okay, so I think that you've got this web of schemas that's going to be a cultural techne. We're going to have the interdependent schemas that are, interdependent schemas, and then those schemas are going to be guiding us in both following the practices that form the structure and also reinforcing that structure. Okay, so let's look at 7, practices in cultural technique. So what I'm going to think about in this section is, okay, so we've got these mechanisms, these cognitive mechanisms that we learn in order to become fluent in a practice. They produce beliefs, right? And those beliefs feed back into supporting the practices. But what's going on when we internalize those schemas? Okay, I think that when we're socialized and internalize a set of schemas, we're becoming participants in a practice. So, bullet. Practices organize us to solve the coordination problems, to establish and affirm relationships and identities, and to distribute power, resources, and knowledge. In very general terms, the practice has 2 interdependent components: the schemas that shape our experience and action, and the resources, which are things of value or disvalue that are managed through the coordinated action. So when we came in here, we were managing something. We were managing airtime, right? We were managing whose ideas get spread and whose don't in this particular occasion, right? Mine, I'm getting the airtime, I'm getting the power of being able to speak and spread my ideas, and you all are being polite, lovely, wonderful listeners. But we were managing that resource, the resource of time and airtime, but also personal time, to sort of exchange ideas. And we managed that by me standing up here with a microphone and you sitting down. So the resource was being managed. And my view is that in all of our practices, what we're doing is coordinating around a resource. Participants in a practice, 3rd bullet on the bottom, internalize the cultural schemas and act accordingly. Practices, however, are logically prior to the behavior and states of mind of the participants. Okay, so here's an example from Rawls. Ironic because Rawls was one of Tommy Shelby's inspirations, mine in a slightly different way. Rawls talks about the practice of promising. He says, okay, you promise someone something, and what happens? You are supposed to forego considerations of self-interest or other kinds of considerations when the time comes in order to keep your promise, right? So when you start teaching children about promises and keeping their promises, they don't really like to do that so much, right? Because they'd rather just do whatever they want, and they don't want to keep their promise. And you say, no, 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 no. Your promise is more important than what you want. Or your promise is more important than this other thing that someone has told you to do, or whatever like that, because you've got to keep your promise. So what happens in that practice of promise keeping is that we socialize people to pay attention to certain things and not others. Pay attention to the promise they made and at the moment, the trigger for now is the moment to keep that promise. And it turns out that when you socialize people well, they don't even want to break their promise, right? Because they know that's the important thing to do. They prune, they kind of structure their consciousness so that really what they want to do is keep their promise. And so that's a part of this enculturation process. And lo and behold, keeping a promise becomes a reason to do even something that they didn't especially want to do. Okay, so let's look at a particular example of the different way that practices can shape our relationship to things. The top of the column on 3. An ear of corn can be viewed as something to eat, as a commodity to be sold, as a religious symbol. Schemas frame our consciousness of and valuing of the object. Corn on our plate is experienced as to be eaten. Corn placed on an altar is to be worshipped. The different schemas or cognitive processes not only offer modes of interpretation, but license different ways of interacting with the corn. These practices may link us and the corn to broad structures of food, commodity, and meaning production. And the effects of our action loop back to influence our cognition. So, yes, you experience it to be eaten, and then you eat it. You're given permission to eat it. If you go and eat the corn on the altar, that's not good, right? There's a practice of placing corn on the altar that if you're socialized right, you know that that's not there to be eaten. But that will link you, that corn and your responsiveness to that corn links you to other religious practices. And your identity can be tied up with being someone who worships the corn, or honors the corn, or does something with the corn. And so your identity gets tied up with those practices. Okay, so let's go down to 8, Racism Revisited. I agree with Shelby that racism has ideological components. But in contrast to Shelby, I don't think that racism is just an ideology. Rather, racism is an ideological formation. It is constituted by an interconnected web of unjust social practices that unjustly disadvantage certain racial groups. Racist practices are not random practices, but are connected by a racist techne. So that, again, a techne is going to be like an operating system that exists abstractly that we draw on, and we have implemented in us. We can attend to a particular racist practice guided by particular schemas, or consider racism more broadly as a structure guided by this broad cultural techne. But a practice that might be unjust when embedded in a certain structure or under certain material conditions may not be unjust in other contexts. So here, this point is that when you see a techne or a set of schemas, you have to be very sensitive to the context before you judge them to be racist or non-racist. Let me give you an example about the distribution of city swimming pools. Suppose your city is shaped like a rectangle, and you are a city planner, and you've decided to put swimming pools in the city. And so you say, to be fair, I'm going to put them evenly spaced. I'll put 9 swimming pools evenly spaced in the city. That might look like it's a fair way to go about doing things, right? What more would you want? But cities almost never have their population evenly distributed over the city, right? Suppose the bottom right corner of the city is where is highly, densely populated with all of the people of color in the city. And the rest of the city is lovely kind of suburbs with trees and roads, and everybody has cars. Okay? If you then say, okay, I'm going to put these 9 swimming pools in equidistant from each other in the rectangle of the city, that wouldn't be fair, right? It wouldn't be fair because you would be giving 1 swimming pool to the densely populated part of the city where people don't have cars, and where it's probably, concreted over, so it's really especially hot, and you would be giving many more per capita swimming pools to the people in the other part of the city. So you've got to look very precisely at the practice and the schema before you can determine whether it's ideological in the sense that it's undergirding unjust social practices. Okay, let's move to 9. Recall that Shelby takes racism to be an ideology and takes ideology to be a set of shared beliefs, so he's a cognitivist about racism. And the main strategy of anti-racist politics, then, is correcting beliefs, with the hope that if we can change minds, we can change how people act. If, however, beliefs and other racist attitudes are outputs from more basic cognitive mechanisms, schemas, concepts, language, and heuristics, and these mechanisms are shaped by the practices we engage in, then it's not clear the best strategy is to take aim at belief, or at least it's not the only strategy. Consider this example. Akna performs a ritual with maize because this is the way to worship. The practice constitutes her reason. It may also be that she believes that performing the ritual will have good effects and others will respect her if she does. But even if those beliefs are false, she has reason to perform it. Because, even if no one knows I'm keeping my promise, even if it's not in my interest to keep my promise, I still keep my promise because the practice gives me reason to do it. Moreover, Akna's performance of the ritual may be in some sense unthinking. She does it because this is what one does. This action may be constitutive of her role, her identity, and who she is. So similarly, I think white supremacy teaches us to be selective in what we notice, what we respond to, and what we value. And I think that it's clear that in police academies, what they do is they train people, they socialize police into being responsive to certain cues, certain triggers, certain things that they're supposed to be aware of, right? And so if you have a police force that is, deeply embedded in white supremacy, it's no wonder that they're going to be socialized or encultured to notice certain things and not others with respect to race. Now, if racism is an ideology in this sense, then it's partly constitutive of social practices that give people reason to act in racist or racially segregating ways. Whom to fear or avoid, where to live, what music to listen to, who to shoot, what to wear, all of those sorts of things. So I think that what's going on is that we have these practices, we're socialized to engage in those practices in these very deep ways. They affect our cognition, and then we don't even see reasons to do things otherwise. We are given reasons by the practice to do things the way that we do them. I think it's, this is one of those things where I feel, I often talk to white people and say, when was the last time you had dinner at a black person's house, a black family's house? When was the last time you even touched a black person other than to shake their hand? And did you even shake their hand, right? There are practices of racial segregation that are going on all the time. And it's not just in these sort of situations of housing segregation. It's all the time that we are engaged in practices of racial segregation. So attempting to change individuals who are socialized into a practice by engaging in debate about their actions is not just typically futile. So you won't go to Akna and say, Akna, don't worship the maize. You go, what? Say, no, there are all these good reasons to think maize isn't really holy. What? Those are not going to move her, right? And that's why oftentimes carrying on a conversation with people and trying to debate with them makes no sense. And I think there's a confusion there about the nature of social agency because it's so practice-driven. Insofar as my action is called for by a practice, the pros and cons of this particular choice to act are set aside. The promise is to be kept, the corn is to be worshipped. Okay, this point is worth stressing. Bias involves epistemic errors, but we don't just make it up. Schemas are learned in and reinforced by social practices. So think of it this way. So you might want to say, oh, with all those false beliefs that people have, just correct them and then we'll be better off. It's not that easy because of this looping that I've been talking about. So women are actually more nurturing than men. We do, women do most of the caretaking in this culture. The sick, the elderly, the infants, the young children. Broadly, culturally, men are not the nurturers, right? Women are the nurturers. So if you tell someone, oh no, women aren't nurturing, men and women are equally nurturing. You look around you, and you go, sorry, No, that's not what's going on. I'm sorry. You may think that's true, but it's not really true. And so it looks like when you're saying, no, men and women are both nurturing, as though you're just playing games. You're not really in tune with the facts of the situation. And so there's this problem here that when you have an ideology that is affecting our practices, our social world starts to conform to the ideology, and just saying, oh, you've got a bunch of false beliefs, it doesn't really work. Okay. And if moreover, that will attempting to change how we perceive and think without changing the social reality responsible for the cognitive schemas we employ is unlikely to be sustainable because it would require ignoring our evidence. Okay, I'm running out of time, but I want to run through 10, and I've mislabeled our conclusion as 7. I'll have to be going backwards for that one, but oh well. So what are we supposed to do here? I think that there are a variety of things you can do. So move to the bullets under 10. As individuals, we can engage others in critical self-reflection and debate, as the cognitivist like Shelby suggests. But I think we should also seek ways to force a shift in the dominant conceptual repertoire and the default skewing of experience, right? You need to mess people's experience up because they're going to be engaged in the practice. And, you know, suppose we came in here and the seats were all gone. Whoa. You'd have to do something different than just sit down there, right? That would be a kind of destabilization through a change in the material conditions. So we want to skew experience. It can be achieved by providing disruptive experiences to those in the grip of an ideology. We might also question the practice of the whole, but note that individuals who resist a practice are easily cast as rule breakers, and their resistance is punished. So the more promising strategy is not try to do it by yourself, but be engaged in a social movement. So a more promising strategy is to challenge everyday practices in public and systematic ways through social movements. They not only challenge false beliefs and challenge the inferences and reasons that people offer for their unjust behavior, they disrupt the very terms and concepts we use to understand the world. Consciousness raising, CR, I think, is a traditional way of doing this. Strategic separatism, radical counterpublics are where you have people who want to resist the dominant ways of understanding, and so they form their own communities, say, in a trans bar or in a lesbian separatist community or in a HBCU or things like that. So these are counterpublics. This disruption challenges us not by rational debate, but by queering our language, playing with meanings, monkey wrenching, or shifting the material conditions that support our tutored dispositions. Social movements destabilize social coordination so that the standard unjust practices no longer do their job, and new practices must be created. The destabilization may be through changes to the material condition, appropriation of linguistic or conceptual tools, so that they no longer have their coordinating function. Okay, my conclusion, 11, not 7. I don't think we should just give up rational discourse, but because I reject cognitivism about ideology in general and racism in particular, I think ideology critique has been conceived too narrowly. There are multiple ways to gain knowledge of social reality and the demands of justice, including experience. And it's hard to have radically new experiences because ideology manages experience for us, but it's not impossible. That's what this disruptive experience does. It says, oh my God, I can't go on the same way I'm used to going on. I'm going to have to go on a different way. Suddenly things I start to notice I didn't. I think that some of the YouTube videos, Black Lives Matter, I think that some, lots of demonstrations, Occupy and such like that, they had the potential to create disruptive experiences so that we couldn't go on as before. Because ideology is not just a set of shared beliefs that is embodied in social practices, we have to go beyond critique to act differently, and not just act individually, but together. We must create new practices that rely on a less distorted and more just cultural technique. Now, we started with the suggestion that implicit bias explains the durability of injustice, that what's in our heads, our implicit bias, our little implicit beliefs. This isn't wholly wrong, I think. But we must situate implicit bias with an understanding of the interdependence of social thought and social structure. Working to correct our own biases may be a minimum requirement on us, but simply changing ourselves is not sufficient. Moral responsibility concerns not only what I personally can and should do, but what we can and should do together. Critique is necessary, but critique requires more than finding errors in our beliefs. In short, collective thought and action in social movements in particular is not only possible, but I think it's morally required. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
I'm getting to my page so I can write down your questions for myself.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. Let me start by saying that I completely agree with you on your criticism of cognitivism. Can you hear me?
Yes. I think you need the mic though.
Okay, so I completely agree with you on your criticism of cognitivism. Clearly it's not just about beliefs. Clearly it's about practices too. But then I was wondering about your definition of ideology. So on page, I think it was on page 3, that you were saying that I read it, that you provided 2 conditions basically. One is being a cultural technique, a kind of operating system, and the other one was leading to unjust social arrangements or perpetuating them, making new ones. I wonder where the distorted reality part went, whether you left it out for a particular reason. And I think that has consequences for your overall account, because so then any kind of cultural technique that leads to unjust arrangements would be an ideology. And it's quite plausible to imagine that all kinds of cultural technique will produce some types of injustices, right? So that's one part of the worry. If you let go of the distorted reality part, then you get this. And the other part of the worry is that, well, if technique on this very, very basic level is ideology, then one could maybe worry about our intuitions of right and wrong not being produced by exactly the same mechanisms, right? So this is why people also prefer to think of ideology in terms of beliefs, because then you will have more foundational beliefs that can correct those.
Yep.
If you say that technique is the ideology, then with Marx we could say, well then our moral intuitions are just produced by, I don't know, material conditions and so on. Right? So both of these words relate to the part that is left out, the distorted reality part.
Great, excellent. So the first question is, in the tradition of ideology and ideology critique, as Tommy Shelby's view suggests, is that we engage in these unjust social practices because we have distorted beliefs about what in fact we're doing. And that actually is quite important, because one of the big questions that ideology is supposed to help us answer is, why do we keep behaving so badly, in a sense? Why do we keep participating in unjust structures unknowingly, even unjust structures that are bad for ourselves, right? Because we do. We participate all the time in these unjust structures that are bad for ourselves. And part of the answer is, well, you've got distorted beliefs. And so I've dropped the distorted belief thing, and in part it's because of this issue about ideology making itself true. So I'm worried about how that if ideology is tremendously successful, then through power, it can make some of those beliefs true. And so then there's a way, it's not clear how distorted they are. So the example of women are nurturing, right? I have a whole bunch of work on generics and how generics work when you have just not all women are nurturing, but just women are nurturing. So it's complicated here. But I think more generally, that, that you can find, for example, you know, why were women not allowed to hold public office? Well, they didn't learn how to read. They weren't educated, right? And so when you say, well, women are not competent to hold public office, it's true they're not competent to hold public office because they haven't been taught to read. But that, of course, you want to push that further back. So so part of what I'm trying to balance here is the importance of saying there's some distortion going on and emphasizing the material power of ideology to sort of make itself true. And I think that's a dimension of it that I'm trying to still capture. So the second question, also excellent, is where do we get the moral or normative critique of ideologies? Because notice I'm saying that ideology is one that produces or underwrites unjust social practices. Who decides what's unjust? That's part of, I mean, traditionally that's been part of the worry. And so there are a lot of people who've worked on ideology and ideology critique who don't want to take a moral stand. They say, no, we have to go at the meta level. We can't say that we can't commit ourselves to a theory of justice. And this is what I'm trying to explore here, is the idea that it's coming out of our notion of coordination. So if you have people who are saying, our form of coordination is unacceptable to me, and I don't want to continue in this form of coordination anymore, that's a prima facie reason, or a pro tanto reason, for thinking that there's something wrong with the conditions of coordination. Now, of course, I mean, as you might imagine, I'm a kind of radical lefty, and so the worry always comes up, well, what about the radical right? And they don't like our form of coordination either, right? And so they're suggesting that the way we do things, for example, same-sex marriage, that's not an acceptable form of coordination. And so this is something that I think has to get worked out more in practice through social movements. So so the picture is something like this, and it's very non-ideal. It's very embedded in the actual movement, and saying, okay, we're trying to coordinate. Our terms of coordination have broken down. We're not willing to coordinate with each other on these terms anymore. Usually based on a kind of experience or a set of values that we have. There's no saying right now what are the right values or what is the right form of coordination, but we've got to find another form of coordination that improves on this in some way. Now you can always say, well, yeah, but then what happens is that it's not always improvement. Sometimes we go backwards. Yes, sometimes we do go backwards. But the hope is that resistant experience and the potential for disruption of coordination will leave us possibilities of finding new and better forms of coordination. No promises. I don't have any promises.
I have two questions. One of them addresses implicit the place you come from, which is philosophy. And I don't mean to be rude, but is it a custom among philosophers, the insularity of philosophy, that philosophy doesn't have to consider, for example, anthropology, Marxism, psychoanalysis, in which they have posed almost the same ideas that you have, the same directions you go, the idea of practice and culture, the idea of ideology as explicit and implicit, so many things that you are mentioning, for example, the usefulness of the concept of unconscious and consciousness, that so many of these things have their sister concepts in other disciplines, including the critique, because in anthropology, for example, the culture concept has been it has been both used and criticized now for like a century. Right. And why not draw on these things? This is one set of questions, and you don't have to take them on, and it may sound rude. You can't say none of your business. You have come to
No,
a philosopher's
I love
meeting.
your question. I love the question. I mean, I think that some of the philosophers in the room might back me up in saying that that's part of my message to philosophers, that I think that philosophers they're so insular. And I spend my time reading more sociology and anthropology and literature and legal theory. Philosophers do talk to the psychologists, but I think that doesn't get the social dimension. And so I've been pushing very hard to think about culture and to think about structures. And so I completely agree with you. But then you could say the same thing about, okay, but then why are you reinventing the wheel, Haslanger, standing up here? We've already done this, hello. But I actually think that philosophy has something to offer, because in the social sciences, they're so anxious about being sciences that they don't talk about normativity, right? They don't really locate where the moral wrongs are, right? Because they want to be, well, they're relativists, most of them, right? Most of the social scientists that I know, and also less so in literary, they don't want to judge other cultures. Me, I'm all about judging other cultures. I'm all about judging my own culture, right? Because I think that there are issues of injustice at stake. So I think that we need to take some of the insights from the social sciences and bring it into philosophy to give epistemic critique and moral critique and these sorts of critiques. So part of what I'm doing is saying, hey, philosophers, you know, hello, they're a culture, because, I mean, part of my critique of philosophy is that philosophers are still committed to a kind of methodological individualism. So you either have individuals with shared beliefs like that, or you have the state, which becomes a new individual, right? And then you ask what justifies the state's actions as if you're asking what justifies my actions. I think that's just so impoverished because, hello, there's such a thing as social life and culture and all the social meanings and all of this. So what I'm trying to do is bring that stuff into philosophy, but also take very seriously the normative questions and take those to some of these other fields. Because I think they've been really neglected.
Right. Regarding the last part, the normative part, on the one hand, I'd like to ask you a very naive question. You clearly start with a critique of implicit, the power of implicit beliefs, common sense, things we take for granted, etc. But I found it striking that both you start your presentation with the idea of social injustice as presented it, or the talk of distortions. What is implicit is that it's obvious what justice means and what is the truth and what is not true, which is distortion. And I will shut up. I just want to make one point, that as my background is anthropology, and one of the things that's stylistic, as you have presented things, there is a problem of presenting things in binaries. For example, either ideology, either it's a closed system, since practices and ideology, they have this, one produces the other, how do you get out of it? Whereas if it's not binaries, there are degrees in which you can have ideological critique, and there are degrees that you can't just talk about it and there has to be practice. There are degrees that practice cannot come without presupposition and a priori, etc. But with anthropologists, I think you are being a little bit unfair. That, for example, with people like Gertz on the one hand, and a long tradition of Marxist anthropology that may present the argument that injustice comes with the emergence of stratified, complex civilizations.
Yeah, well, Marx, I mean, I'm happy to own Marx as a philosopher, right? I don't think Marx was an anthropologist. And I think that Marx did have an implicit normative theory about exploitation as a form of injustice. But notice, I mean, I don't think anthropologists have spent a lot of time talking about exploitation and the nature of exploitation as injustice. That's not where they talk about it. So I'm owning that tradition as partly philosophical because of its normativity. Because in my experience, talking to anthropologists, hanging around in universities, you know, talking about justice in the anthropology department, sociology department, or those departments, it's not as well received, let's put it this way, because of the anxiety about being scientific and being value-free. But wait, okay. So but the other point is that in the context of binaries, I have a lot of wiggle room in all of the picture about the messiness of socialization and the messiness of individuality of the way that we live these, the possibilities of fragmentation and fracturing. All of that is just throughout my work, and also the ways in which individuals can both be part of a social milieu and be ideologically informed, but also resistant because they're autonomous. All of that is throughout my work. But you're suggesting that we shouldn't think of justice or injustice as a binary. I'm with that. I think that there are degrees of justice, but I do think, so this is a methodological place where I'm beginning. I'm beginning as a feminist, anti-racist theorist, and it's not my starting point to say, is sexism unjust or is racism unjust, or is the killing of black men by cops for walking down the middle of the street, is that unjust or not unjust? That is my starting point. And so methodologically, I'm what's called a non-ideal theorist. I am a critical theorist, and I think that, for me, is a crucial part of being a critical theorist, is not pretending to some neutrality that is not value-laden and is not engaged in the movement. So if I think about, so when I say to people, I say, okay, I'm not a feminist philosopher, I'm a feminist theorist. Because feminist philosophers look at old philosophical problems and bring gender to them. I'm a feminist theorist because I start with the movement, and I try to figure out what tools the movement needs. And so I'm not claiming, I don't want to be neutral here. I don't want to be neutral. I want to call injustice what I take injustice to be. If someone's going to come to me and say, I'm sorry, no, racism, that's really not unjust, I say, oh dear, you know, I'm not currently in conversation with you because that's not my starting point. And we maybe need to spend some time together, and I need to take you on a walk. I need to give you new experiences. If you don't think that this form of behavior and these practices are unjust, you haven't lived in my world. So let's go for a walk, and I will give you new and disruptive experiences. So that's part of where I'm coming from, is saying, just reasoning with someone who says that these practices are not unjust, that's hopeless. I've got to disrupt them. I've got to find different ways for them to be in the world so that they can begin to see those sorts of things.
All right, in the interest of coordinating around resources, we are running short on time. We have many hands. I'm going to move on to the next question.
Hi, Dr. Haslanger.
Hi. You can call me Sally. Anybody can call me Sally.
Hi, Sally. So I have a question about the graphic that you have,
Yeah.
And the relationship between practice and schema and technique.
Yeah.
And my concern is in part motivated by, it seems like the object of your paper here is to talk about critique is engaged in criticizing practices, and also these technique and schema. But I'm sort of wondering which of these is the proper object of the kinds of critical practices we might engage in, whether it's social movements or self-reflection or whatever. Are we engaging in a transformationist schema for the sake of undoing unjust practices, or are we engaging in a project of dismantling unjust practices for the sake of transforming schema?
So I think that where the injustice lies is in the practices, but part of the practices involves the schema. So practices consist in a schema that organizes us around the resources. So to engage in a practice, is to have the schema be guiding us in our interaction around the resources. So there are two things that schemas do. One of them is they highlight what is valuable, or what from the point of view of the ideology is valuable. So you can criticize that aspect of the practice that is organized around things that misunderstands their value or doesn't appreciate their value. Or you can say the way that the practice is organizing us to coordinate and distributing that value is unjust. And so what I want to do is break down those practices, but there's different ways you can do it. So one way you break down the practice is mess with the material conditions. Like I imagine you come in here and there are no chairs. What are you going to do, right? Are you going to sit on the floor? Or are you going to do, what are you going to do? And there are lots of great examples of revolution where you disrupt the material resources, and that's how you get the change. So that's disrupting the resources that are supposedly to be distributed. The other way to disrupt a practice is mess with people's schemas, so that when they encounter those resources, they don't go do the same ordinary things. So the sites of injustice are in the mode of valuing and in the distribution that are part of the practice. And so you can mess around with how the practice works to get, hopefully, more just practices. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of wonder about whether or not it's sufficient to change practice without also engaging in a really radical critique of schema too. So we can think of all sorts of examples of instances where racist or heterosexist practices have changed, but the underlying schema doesn't seem to have.
Good point. Good point. So here's how another way of seeing it. In the picture, there's a certain amount of feedback, right, looping. And another way to think about my view, and I was trying to emphasize that I wasn't totally anti-cognitivist, is that, the practice, we internalize the schemas that produces beliefs and other sorts of things that feed back and reinforce the practice. And actually, you can do critique in any one of these different points, right? You can critique the belief, and that can get people to change the practice. Sometimes, not so much, right? But sometimes, yes. And then sometimes you're going to have to change the material conditions because people are so stuck in their heads that they're going to keep doing it as long as that trigger is there, right? As long as the stop sign is there, they're going to stop, whether you like it or not, right? Whether they should or not, they're going to stop. So there's these certain entry points for critique. And I think that it is highly context specific and issue specific what's going to be the best way to destabilize these loops so that we have something else. And I think that they tend to be equilibria, so I think that they'll tend to readjust, and in light of certain adjustments to beliefs or certain adjustments to material conditions, they're very, very stable. But so the point that I'm working on here is just, I think that the cognitivist tradition in ideology and ideology critique is just too narrow. It gives us one tool, and it's a tool that you convince the elites to change the laws, or you convince the elites to come up with the good science, and then maybe people will change, right? But I think that we've seen that's not true. Brown v. Board of Education, which is the desegregation law that was passed in the 50s by the Supreme Court and was not implemented until the 60s, right? That was legislative activism. It was the elites were convinced that desegregation was absolutely essential. But notice that schools are more segregated now than they were in the 50s and 60s. Why? Because there was white flight, right? Desegregation happened in the cities, there was white flight, and now we have segregated schools. But they're not de jure segregated schools, they're de facto segregated schools. So there's these situations where I want to say, going the route of changing beliefs and changing structures isn't going to work all the time unless you have a change in the norms, in the meanings, in a lot of the other things that's going to happen. So in the case of, well, I don't want to go too long onto education, but so I'm actually very supportive of the idea that, but same-sex marriage, that may work. It may work. It may not be like Brown v. Board of Education. It may be that there's going to be a broad-scale acceptance of different kinds of couples now because that there is same-sex marriage. We'll see. I don't know. I think that there is of a certain generation. I think that I'm somewhat optimistic. There's not the white flight kind of issue happening, but we kind of have to see.
I'll try to make this quick. What you were just talking about is germane to this question. The question is, how much disruptive experience does it take to get attitudinal change or behavior change? And I want to ask it particularly in relation to climate change.
Yeah.
I'm an environmentalist, and I see a lot of people are worried, and even I myself and a lot of us aren't doing as much as needs to be done. So anyway, do you have any comments on that?
Well, again, I think it's going to vary. I mean, the problem with climate change, one of the problems with getting activism around climate change really in a broad way is that for a lot of people, the effects are very long-term, and they don't see the benefits immediately to them of their changed behavior, and it's hard for them to imagine the long-term consequences. And so there's going to be an important, so it's more difficult, I think, to get people to think more abstractly about their choices about climate change. But suppose we just shut down the grid for 24 hours in the whole East Coast. Like, shut it down. Let everybody go without heat or light or hot water or anything. Let's try it and say, okay, you want to know what climate change is going to be like? Let's talk about it, right? Let's shut it down, or let's, something like that. So I wouldn't suggest doing that. Don't try this at home. But if there were, there have been. I'm a vegetarian. I've been kind of invested in vegetarian sort of action along the way. And then there's a spectrum, like PETA at one end, and then just rescuing dogs at the other end, or whatever. There's always going to be a huge spectrum, and what works. I think personally, this also shows why I'm a philosopher and not an activist. I considered being an activist. I'm not a very good activist, in part because I can't predict what's going to work, and I don't have that feel for it. But I think there are people who have a much better feel. My own view is that we got to be more radical than we are now about almost everything.
Just a question that I'm saying about a lot of different contexts. How much disruptive experience does it take? You have a disruptive experience when you get to know a person from another race and you go, oh my God, that's a wonderful person. But you still might have that attitude for a long time. But you have to give that one experience doesn't change.
Completely. See, this is why I'm interested in how disruptive experiences need to be embedded in changes in the practices. And so it's not just, whoa, look at me, I sat next to a black person. That black person was really friendly, and now, because if your practice continues just the same, nothing's going to happen. And I think that sometimes what we need to do to change the practices, and it's very hard to do it by yourself, oftentimes. I think in that particular case you can do it by yourself. Spend more time being an integrated context. But I think that that's what we need movements for, is they create spaces to do certain things. They create spaces for community. So in my community, which is, in my neighborhood, which is very mixed and socioeconomically, racially, with people, immigrants and non-immigrants, is we have an Area 4, our neighborhood's called Area 4, don't ask, but and we have these potlucks, Area 4 potlucks, where people come together, and we have an Area 4 kind of news board email list so that people can come together for potlucks once a month. And that's a new practice. That's a different kind of practice, where for a long time people would live next to each other but hardly know their neighbors. But now, that's a new practice that institutes. But that can be done kind of by a single person, but it's better if you've got a group of people who are going to work together to make it happen. So that's the sort of stuff. I think just individual experiences aren't really usually going to do the job. You need a movement to do it.
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. So, I heard you saying we need to supplement the cognitivist account, but also you seem to be saying that the cognitivist account is going to have certain failings when it comes to adequately explaining these phenomena. And so I wanted to pick up on that and maybe entertain a possible response from the cognitivists. So I want to go back to the example with the women are nurturing. And so the cognitivist idea that, you know, the racist or the sexist beliefs are distorted beliefs, and you said, well, the problem is sometimes material conditions actually create the very reality such that women are more nurturing. And so I guess I'm wondering what the cognitivists would just say is, well, in fact, you're equivocating. You haven't really filled out the full belief. The belief is not women are nurturing, but women are more inherently nurturing, or, you know, not just that black people commit more crimes, but they are more like essentially criminal as a matter of a natural fact. So once you fill that out, it actually does do a better job of accounting for the phenomena. So maybe there's not so much a failing, but just, again, this account in need of supplementation.
Yeah, so I think that's an important observation. In fact, my view about generics, so generics are claims like mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus, dolphins attack bathers, barns are red, cars have radios, yeah, and tigers have stripes. Notice they all have a plural noun to start with without a quantifier. There's no almost, some, anything like that. And so, and these are ubiquitous, and we rely on them all the time. And it is, in fact, my view that when we assert things like women are nurturing in many contexts, not all contexts, we implicate that they are by nature or inherently or intrinsically or something like that. Now, it's a little tricky because it's not in all cases, because barns are red by nature, or cars have radios by nature, or things like this. It's tricky, and so it's a very complicated set of issues there. What I was trying to get at, however, is that I think that conversation about what is meant by women are nurturing is really difficult, because we do look for natures or sort of deep features, generalizations and regularities. And if someone says women are nurturing by nature and uses the ubiquity of women's being nurturing as evidence of it, and I say, well, women are not nurturing, it's because of the social context in which they're nurturing, neither of us actually has really good empirical evidence one way or the other, right? I mean, it's a hard conversation to have, because we have never lived as humans not in social contexts. We have never lived in a situation where we had a kind of test case where women weren't doing the majority of the nurturing. So the causal explanation of women's nurturing is kind of up for grabs. Now, I personally have a story which tells us why this happens and why it's a social phenomenon and it's not by nature. And also I have a critique of what it means by nature and all of that sort of stuff. But I think that that's a very complicated conversation, and I think that in many of the contexts where we're trying to disrupt ideology, getting into that conversation isn't going to be that helpful. Does that help? I'm happy. We could talk later, maybe?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So we have time for 2 short questions of Mary Beth, and then one back here, and then
Thank you very much for your talk. So my question is about the role of resources here, and I wanted to go back to what a couple of people, or someone else mentioned, the question of Marxian thought and ideology, because sort of roughly speaking there, it seems like you don't get ideology without a certain set of practices related to resources, labor, power, other kinds of things. And ideology is supposed to actually grow out of that. It's supposed to be a function of that, those very, very basic forms of dealing with resources.
Yeah.
So my question is how to think about that in relation to your proposals.
I think it's exactly what I think.
Okay, yeah, and so then that's what I was trying to get at, yeah. So then it's just a matter of kind of generalizing what counts as the resources perhaps, and that's very interesting to me, and it seems to imply that that looking at the very specific ways in which the resources you're talking about are distributed, because you also talked about the distribution,
Yeah.
that would really kind of mirror the kind of thing that Marxians do.
Right.
And it seems like you're going to get lots of different stories about, whether it's airtime or care or whatever, for really on the micro level of how the distributions are working, such that they yield the ideological levels that you're discussing. Is that?
So I think
the other way, also the
I think it goes, so one of the things that sort of the people who interpret Marx as a kind of committed to crude economism, say it's all bottom up, all material. And so I don't think that's true.
Right.
And I don't even think it's true in Marx. I think there's an interdependence. And so, we distribute the resources and develop a practice of distributing these ways, right? And the resources can be time or money or all kinds of valuable or unvaluable things. And so we start doing it, and then it's that distribution is done habitually in a practice, maybe sometimes by a rule. There are all these different ways that it gets done. And so the very distribution itself is a practice from my point of view.
Right, okay, I see that now, yeah.
And so it's a practice, and I also want to add to it the practice of distribution, but also the practice of identifying what is valuable or not valuable. So there's going to be this combined thing that the ideology helps us do, is determine what has value and what doesn't, what kind of value it has. So I mean, I mentioned to someone earlier that I think one of the things that capitalism does is treats everything as a commodity, right? And so nothing has inherent value. It's all just value in the market. I mean, that's a crude overgeneralization, of course, but one of the things that you can critique capitalism for is not just the bad forms of cooperation and distribution of the time, labor, and all of that, but the misidentification of the value of certain kinds of things. And that, I think, comes from these schemas as well. So one criticism of me, I think, is totally legitimate, is I have this black box schema. It's supposed to be doing all the work. All the interesting work is supposed to be happening there, but I'm trying to slowly disaggregate the bits and pieces of it and show us where there's errors. And there is a kind of, it's not always distortion, sometimes it's being incomplete. So in the case of what's valuable, we may not even notice certain things. We don't value or disvalue them. We have no attitude toward them at all because we've been prevented from seeing their value. And so there's a kind of distortion there, but there's also a kind of ignorance that is going on there. But I want my view to be in an Iris Young sense, a materialist view. I want it to be that, and so here's an example that I like to use. So curb cuts. Curb cuts were introduced through the Americans with Disabilities Act to make it possible for people in wheelchairs or other mobility challenges to gain access to public places like libraries and City Hall and things like that. It was also important because it put people who were mobility challenged in the public sphere, public space, so they became normalized, more acceptable, whatever. Turned out that women benefited, right? Because strollers. You could get strollers into the public library. You could get strollers into City Hall. You could get strollers and you get strollers in public space. Have you noticed recently that strollers don't look like they used to look? They're now much tougher, and they're not all pink or baby blue, and that actually sometimes men use them to stroll babies. So there's this idea that once this strolling came out of the private sphere into the public sphere, that it became one of the items that, and of course there are economic considerations and all of those sorts of considerations too, but the material change of curb cuts that wasn't intended or envisioned to have any benefit with respect to gender and parenting had a positive effect. And I think that's kind of cool. And so I want there to be both ways of, it's all kind of interdependent. We've got to move in different ways. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening. I was reading, I guess, something before, trying to do, research on you, so I kind of knew what to expect. I guess one article you said that race was both natural and social. Why do you think it's both instead of?
I don't think race is natural.
Well, maybe I misread the article because the article said that you thought it was both. I will go back and look at that.
No, I think that there are physical markers of race that like eyelid shape, hair texture, skin color, and such. But I don't think that's race. I think that I use this term color in quotes. That they are the markers for race. And that what race is the use of those markers, or not the use of a group is racialized if there are a set of markers that are usually associated with, historically, with a geographical region. And there's an assumption that the person with those markers had ancestry in that geographical region, and that there's an ideology which then situates people within a social hierarchy based on those assumptions. So the idea is, look, you know, I'm marked as white or as Euro-American. Who knows? You know, maybe I have some amount of other kinds of ancestry, but I'm marked as of European origin. And as a result, I get the white privilege, right? I'm situated in a racial hierarchy. So, at the top of the racial hierarchy. So race is real. So on my view, so some people think that if you're a social constructionist about race, you have to say race is not real. That's not my view. I think race is really real. It's too real. But our job is to do away with race and to make race no longer exist. Because I think that a group is racialized through this interpretation that is filtered through an ideology to situate people in a hierarchy. But the only thing natural about it is that usually in the case of race and gender, physical features are taken to be the markers. But they're different, and it happens differently in different cultures. So different markers. So in Brazil, different markers count as different basis for racialization. Sorry? Yeah, right. And so it's a much more complicated marking system that then situates you in this hierarchy of racialization. Does that help? No, I'm one of those people. So I think maybe people confuse because they think that sometimes I'm a social constructionist. So sometimes people think social constructionists think that, you know, it's an illusion. No, I never said that. Yeah. No, I didn't think you did. But sometimes that's what people want to attribute to social constructionists. So I think race is totally real, but it's totally socially constructed, and there's no natural stuff going on there.
Right. Thank you, and let's thank Professor Haslanger.